Okay, hello and welcome to our Poppies and Petals hand embroidery kit. This is going to be your video tutorial. So you'll find all the instructions in here. You can break it into the chapters if you're looking for something specific. And you will be able to reference sometimes throughout the guide. I'm going to go through all of the elements, but we will have in your digital file some quick tutorials that are not pattern specific, but will also help you if you just need to go through a quick tutorial. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the fact that you will potentially have one of three different kits. You may have the kit with just the fabric and you'll need to transfer your pattern. That kit may or may not come with a heat erasable pen. If it did come with a heat erasable pen, if you purchase that separately, you'll transfer with that pen, and then when we're done, you'll use heat to erase the lines. If it did not come with that pen, you can use any pencil or pen. I highly suggest using like a really light touch when you're transferring, if you're using like a pencil or something like that, just so that the lines are really faint and you're not going to see them as much as like a heavy black pen. Like when we're using the heat erasable pen, the lines can look quite messy, but then they disappear after. So if you're using a regular pen that's not going to disappear, I highly suggest you just do something lighter like a pencil. And then the last one is going to be our pre-transferred fabric, which is a colored fabric that is already set for you. So if you ordered this one, you can just skip this transferring step and we'll pick back up at prepping your hoop. So for the transferring, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to just trace our pattern. So depending on the kit you have, obviously you might have this pen, if not, pencil. And then how you want to do this is just going to depend on your comfort level and what supplies you have. So I own a light pad. You can use something like this if you have it. It just has like a backlight. So this backlight or light pad just has light, which will like illuminate behind. You could also use, a lot of people will purchase an app on their iPad called LightPad, and then you would do a similar thing and you would use your illuminated iPad as your light from behind. But then the simplest option is to actually tape your fabric to your pattern to your window, and then trace out. So this one is a pretty, there's quite a bit of elements to this, so it'll take you a little while to transfer. However you decide to do that. The light pad is something that I just got from Amazon for $20, under $20 Canadian. So you're just going to transfer your pattern, doing exactly what I'm doing here, just following the lines. For these blue lines, you can add the lines to help show you the guide. The blue lines are going to be just the guide in the direction that you're going to be stitching your lines. So it's not necessarily something that you'll need if you need it. You can reference it from the pattern, or you can draw it just so you have kind of a guide. For the French knots, if you are doing a non-heat erasable pen, do just a tiny dot. These are quite large knots. You don't want that to see from behind. So if you are doing just a non-erasable pen, just be careful. And then the one thing that you'll need to remember as you're stitching is that you want to cover those lines. With a heat erasable pen, we don't worry as much about covering the line. We kind of go onto the line. When you're stitching with a non-erasable pen, you're going to have to cover it. So you'll want to stitch to the outside of your line. So just keeping that in mind when you're drawing. Like, I wouldn't necessarily draw a thick line on the outside of my woven wheels because we don't want that to show from behind. So keeping that in mind while you're transferring. So yeah, just small dots for your French knots, which are just any of these little circles. And then I will see you back here when you're done your transferring process, and we'll start putting our fabric into our hoop. So the next part after we've finished our transferring is putting our pattern into our hoop. So for this pattern, you've got a 6-inch hoop. We're just going to open it up. We've got two sides. I'm going to put the back down, and then you're just going to slide your outer hoop on top. And then we're going to tighten it into our fabric. All right, so just for reference, if your lines don't look as close to the edge of this pattern, please don't be alarmed. This actually is a slight error in the way that my printer printed this. So if yours is a little bit in further, that's actually how it's supposed to be. Because if you look at this, it's not actually supposed to be that close to the edge. But we're still going to stitch on this one. Just yours will be correctly scaled. But for the sake of keeping my stitching going. Okay, so we've got our hoop in there. You're gonna actually want to tighten this as much as possible. So I have a tiny little screwdriver that I keep near so that I can really tighten up this hoop, because with my fingers, that was the furthest I could get it. You really want that nice and tight to hold your fabric as tight as possible. Okay, so for stitching this pattern, you do have no right or wrong way you're gonna stitch it. The way that I've laid out the instructions is as easily as possible to keep you from bouncing around too much, but also being able to follow the written instructions and the video instructions as seamlessly as possible. So you will have your stitch and color guide here. It's labeled to show you most of the ones. There are some gaps in like where I've labeled things just because it gets too repetitive and a little bit too cluttered. So you should be able to look and say, this one says straight stitch for this. This also looks the same. So it's also a straight stitch, but I have labeled the colors, especially the pinks, since they get a little confusing. There's a little legend here for your yellow poppies to make it a little clearer. They all have the same lower color is a lighter, darker in the back, and then your accent is all the same. Some of them have the French knot, some of them just have the straight stitch. So should be able to find all the information you need. You might need to apply logic to a few things just to fill in the gaps, but that is to avoid it being too cluttered. So your video instructions and your digital instructions for the written are going to follow the same pattern. I'm going to start with our yellow poppies, and you'll go around. What I do recommend is once I've shown the lower part of the yellow poppy, apply that to all of them. Show the back part, apply that. Show the accents, apply that. Then you're not switching for each poppy the 3 different colors. You'll do all of the lighter yellows on all 5 of them, all of the darker yellows. And then that keeps you from changing your needle color over and over and over again. And then, you know, I try to group things as much as possible. So we'll do the stems and then the leaves. And I would say, you know, we're going to do all of our stems except for down here in our darker blue. You can do all of the stems. Then we can jump over and do all of our dark leaves. Then we can jump into our light blue. You'll do this stem and your lights and then all your light blues. So kind of trying to apply that logic, but at the same time we can't. I'm not going to be stitching the entire pattern, each element from start to finish. I'm going to show you each element one time. You'll apply what you've learned, and then we'll move on to the next element. So just so you know, you can try to save yourself time by doing elements you've already learned in the same shade, or you can just, you know, take your time and follow it as closely as possible. The written instructions give you broken down by stitch. Same with this, and then you'll apply what you learn. So we're going to jump right into stitching. We've got our hoop in here, and we're going to do threading our needle next and splitting our strands and applying how we apply that. So I will see you back here in a second. If you don't have your fabric in your hoop, get that ready, and then we'll start with DMC. We're going to start with DMC 3821, the lighter yellow, and we're going to get going on our poppies. Okay, we are starting with DMC 321 in 3 strands. So if your floss is still in a skein, you're going to pull from the numbered end of your skein because that's the end that they're designed to not unravel. If yours is on a color card, you just unravel it. Each one comes in a piece the correct size. So they are an arm's length, or at least they're my arm's length, which is about how much thread we want for stitching. So we're just going to snip our thread at about an arm's length, and then we are going to divide our threads. So your thread comes in 6 little strands. You want to split it. We're going to be working with 3 strands for a lot of this pattern, except for a few parts which will be labeled on your pattern as an exception in some of them. So for French knots, there are some that will show that they are less or more. There's some information. And then for this, 3 strands. Woven wheels are going to be 12. So you do jump around a little bit, but most you can assume are going to be 3 strands. So we've separated our strands. I'm going to put my one pile to the side, and I'm going to quickly tie a little knot in the end of my thread. I just do it by creating a little loop, pulling it through, and closing it. You can also follow the tutorial for a quilter's knot if you're interested in using a quilter's knot. Just gonna grab my needle, threading your needle. I'm just gonna pinch the wet tip, slip it through, and then pull your thread through. So for our poppies, I'm actually going to start with probably the most intricate one, just to give you the best example I can of how you're going to stitch this. So these two are probably the most intricate. I'm going to start with this little one here, just because I want to show you the best example I can of how to stitch it. Sorry, I just looked at my pattern. I don't know why I have a second little line right here, but I do, but we're gonna just ignore that. So I'm gonna start with my outer petals, starting from the center. So this is considered like a satin stitch or a satin stitch flower, but how I would stitch it was I started in the center and I split it in half, and then I stitched it like I would a flower leaf or petal, sorry, a flower satin stitch. So a little bit of a shorter strand. Sorry, got something stuck on the back there. Okay, and I'm kind of going longer and a little shorter and a little longer, but mostly just filling this in with a satin stitch. Each little section, I'm gonna stitch individually. I'm gonna tuck this stitch behind just to give it the right angle. And then I'm going to come back and do my other side. On this side specifically, I'm going to do some shorter stitches. So because I don't have as much space at the bottom as I need, so I need to fill in the top here, but I want everything to kind of conjugate at the bottom here to create that folded petal look, if that makes sense. So I want to curve my stitches into one spot. So I'm doing some of them a little bit shorter. I can't do all of my stitches to the same spot, or else you're going to end up with kind of like a bump in there, because all your thread will be in the same, ending in the exact same spot. So I'm doing some shorter stitches so that I'm still filling in the space, but I'm going in the same angle and the same direction. This one I'm going to do a little bit longer, so it now covers this ending point. So you don't see that. If you look now, it doesn't, you can't tell that these ones don't end at the very bottom because I've used a long stitch to cover that stopping point. So now I've met up at the very bottom there, and I just have a few stitches along the side, which I will tuck underneath this most recent long stitch. So kind of coming in on an angle. It creates a little bit of a curve to your petal, which is what you want, which kind of gives the illusion that it is that 3D shape. Just like when you're like doing shading or, you know, if you're coloring with a pencil crayon on a on a coloring page, you're going to want to have your strokes going in a certain direction to create the illusion that they curve. If every line is perfectly straight, you're just going to have this flat look, if that makes sense. So this helps create that curve that all of the petal is thickest here, and then it kind of curves in and rounds out the bottom of that leaf, or that petal, I guess. So creating a shorter stitch. I think I missed a spot. I got like a little gap here, so I'm going to come back in through there, make that one a little longer. And you can do that if you make a space that's too wide between one stitch and the other. You can come back in and add a stitch between those to fill that space in. So I'm going to do a longer one, and then I'm going to work on a few shorter. This definitely doesn't have an exact science. Everyone's stitches are going to be spread apart a little bit differently. So I can't tell you do one stitch here, one stitch here, but you will do about one long stitch, sometimes two shorter ones, especially as you get to the edges. You'll do a longer stitch, normally two shorter stitches. So your first short stitch will be the shortest. Your next short stitch will be a little bit longer. And then your third short stitch, you'll want to tuck in behind. Again, you're trying to cover the short part that you just did by making it overlap. Actually, this one I'm pretty much out of stitches that I need. I don't have another spot that I need to put a stitch. So it's the idea of this radial satin stitch where you're doing shorter, a little longer, and the idea is that the longer stitches cover the end of the shorter stitches until you have one stitch that goes all the way down to the full satin, creating the illusion that they all went down that far because you're covering the end point. And that way, not all of your stitches are having to go all the way to the bottom because you just don't have the space, and you just will end up with kind of like a bump. Okay, so we've created our two outer petals, and now we're going to finish this little half petal kind of in the center, and I'm going to go into that middle point. And now that's my first guideline. And the rest will do sort of same thing. And make that one a little shorter. This area, I'm going to do short, long, I think, short, long. To fill it in. And the one thing I'll say here is sometimes less is more. Like if you do too many stitches, you're going to end up, like right now, I don't want to cover the edge of this petal that I've created, the first petal I created, because then you won't see the line of where the edge is, which you want to have those lines defined. So not covering it, just skimming the side of each other so that you can see that they're both defined petals. You can see where the line of the other one is. And then again, try to kind of come into the same center-ish point. Tucking my last stitch kind of underneath to round it out and just fill it in without too much bulk. Okay, so we've done our light yellow in 3821, and I'm just going to quickly show you how I tied that off at the back. Sorry, my needle came off. Made a bit of a mess here, sorry. Okay. So when you're finishing off the back with your knots, you can actually split the strands and do like a little knot like that. That's a method that I use specifically when my needle accidentally comes off my thread. and I don't feel like rethreading my needle just to do the technique I often use. But sorry, that took me a minute with the angle of the camera. Okay, so we've got our needle on our thread. We finished our stitching and we just want to secure this. And one of the best ways to do that is actually to take your needle and run it underneath the stitches that you have there, securing it behind. You can take your needle and go through that loop that you've created and pull, which will create kind of like a little knot. It's not fully necessary, but it does help to secure it. If you do that, I suggest, if you don't do that part, if you don't make a little knot, you can weave it under maybe 2 or 3 times. And if you do that, you probably only have to weave it under 1. And then of course, we're gonna give it a little trim, and then we're done with tying off the back. If you are obviously not going on to the next portion of this and you still have lots of yellow on your needle, I would jump over. I would start working on the yellow here, start working on the yellow here, and I would just work my way around the pattern. In this case, I ran out of yellow, and I'm only going to show you guys an example on one of the poppies, so I'm ready to move on to my next color. We are going to do 3852 in 3 strands again. So I'm just getting my arm's length of thread and getting that on my needle, and I will meet you back here. Okay, our next step is the back part of our petal. So this one is quite a large one. And in this process, you're actually going to be covering where those French knots will go. What we'll do is we'll just reference our pattern template to see. You will stitch, like you can stitch kind of up to them. You don't have to stitch over them. You will stitch over the guidelines for the accent stitches. Yeah, we don't have to fully go under there, but all right, so we've got DMZ 3852 on our needle, and we are doing again a satin stitch. This one is a little bit more, you do have more space to go in. So you'll be able to do more of the longer stitches, for example. But you are still kind of breaking them into like sections. So this sort of bump, I'm going to consider this section of the petal, and then this bump, I'm going to consider this section of the petal, and this bump, I'm going to consider this section. So kind of finding a spot that so I'm doing like that piece a bit of more of a straighter stitch, and then I'm going to start angling them in a bit more. So doing that shorter stitch. So I have a little knot at the back here. I could feel something twisting up. So I'm going to just show you guys really quickly. So if you have a knot, do not try to pull too tight. See how it's sort of looped there? The truth is, it's actually not a real knot. It's just where your fabric or your thread has twisted up. So if you very gently pull it, if it's too tight at the knotted part, you might need to stick your needle in and separate it a little bit and then pull the 2 ends apart and it'll unravel. Okay, so back to our angle here. If we were to follow the same angle as that straight, you'd kind of have like these little tiny stitches going this direction. And the goal is to have it all kind of look like it's all pointing in towards the stem area, right? Because that's how a regular tulip would be. All the parts would kind of gravitate in towards the center. So this is all pointing in, and then we're going to sort of angle them so that these aren't super choppy little pieces. I'm kind of tucking that one in behind. just sort of meeting up at the end of that one. I'm doing very tiny little stitch there. So you want to try to get it to lay as flat as possible. Just a short little stitch. And then we're back to the other side of this. I'm going to do a long stitch. I'm actually going to come over to this edge right here. And I'm going to come into where I want this part of the petal to end. So we're going to do maybe like right here. Okay. And then what I want for that is then it gives me a bit of a guideline of where the other stitches in the center of that section are going to go. Because if I had kept on the same angle, I might have ended up being like, oh, how do I fill in this little bit? So it kind of sets like the framework when you split the sections, and then, which is a really good technique for the satin stitch, because then you just fill in between those barriers, keeps your angles where you want them. Make sure that you're filling it in evenly. I've got another knot. So I just did the same thing. I just pulled it back a little bit and pulled the two ends gently to unravel that knot. And then yeah, just filling this in with a satin stitch. Because I have a wider base on this section, like it's not conjugating in such a small area, you can do more of a traditional satin stitch. So then we're going to pop over here, and I'm going to start the same kind of thing where I'm going to pick my spot, come down, and then for this one, we're going to do the same thing. It's such a big area. I want to split it into sections to make it easier to follow. So we're still even though that's covering a little bit of where my French knot is, I want to go over it a little. We'll just overlap our French knots onto there. So creating those guidelines and then filling them in. So basically I just split, we'll start over here. I just split the section I've already split. Then I'm going to split it again and keep halving it until it's full. Okay, so that was halved. Now I'm going to half this one. I'll go back over here. Cut this one in half. And sometimes the beauty of this is you end up using less stitches because you realize, oh, I would have maybe put 2 stitches there, but I actually only needed 1. And then you can kind of follow your needle through between the stitches to make sure that you're on the right guide. Split this one straight down the center. And then yeah, you just end up filling in between your sections. Sometimes I do have to run my needle through just to make sure I'm finding the scent like in between the stitches, and then you don't overlap accidentally. And then the one thing too is like right now, I don't have any space left at the bottom here. So this is a good time to be like, I need to throw in a short stitch. And then if you've done your short stitch last, sometimes it can feel like you can really see it. So you can just run your needle underneath, which helps blend out that. Especially when there just isn't that much room at the base anymore. Like there's maybe one spot for a stitch, but I actually still want to put another stitch in here. So I just kind of run my needle down until it feels like there isn't any room left. Throw in my short stitch. It's another method of seeing to help show you where that short stitch belongs. And then the same thing here. We're going to start in the center, go to about where those French knots start, and we're just going to split it. And it may seem like, oh, you're throwing stitches all over the place, but that is kind of, that is sort of what you end up doing. And then you just fill it in. It helps. I promise it's easier than trying to go one beside each other, because then your angle can sometimes get thrown off and you don't realize it till you're at the very end. Okay, I'm gonna fill in this little corner here to show you how that would work, and then you obviously know how to fill in this edge. So I'm gonna tuck this one behind. I'm doing that short stitch again because I'm trying to keep an angle where I don't cover this. So if I was going straight down, I would have ended up covering that. So I'm kind of like shortening my stitches just to make sure that it covers this corner, but doesn't cover the actual petal that's behind right there. And then the same technique for the rest of it, just splitting it. And I am out of thread. So we are done with the dark 3852 yellow. I'm gonna let you finish the back petals of all of your poppies, and then meet me back and we'll start on 832 in our French knots and our accent stitches. So I will see you back. I'm gonna do the same tie off method that I did before. You'll use that for any time you're changing your thread. Okay, so for our accent stitches and for our French knots, we're gonna be using 832 in 3 strands. So for all of them, so I'm gonna pull that off my needle and get that onto my needle in 3 strands with 1 arm's length. All right, so for this pattern, I recognize that the wording in some of the instructions for how many strands to use is slightly confusing. It says this pattern uses 3 strands with the exception of French knots and woven wheels unless otherwise stated. And what it should have said was this pattern uses 3 strands unless otherwise stated in the exception of French knots and woven wheels. So what that means is that everything will use 3 strands in this pattern except for some of the French knots and the woven wheels. So these French knots and these straight strands are 3 strands. So it kind of implies that this would be 6 strands for your French knots and then 3 strands for your straight stitches. The rest of your French knots are 6 strands, which is stated on there. These ones are 3. You can definitely, if you were seeing this after you've done some of your French knots on this part in 6 strands, it will look fine. Like it's not that dramatic. You'll probably just actually have to do less French knots than we're gonna do using 3 strands. The reason that I did 3 in the center here was because we're using 3 strands for the other parts of it. So it just made more sense to use 3 strands as well. Not because it makes an aesthetic difference. So I am aware that the wording there, I am not great with words. I am much better with video instructions. I try to be as clear as possible, but sometimes the way I write things just doesn't make as much sense, and I am aware of that on here. So we are going to use 3. If you've already used 6, please don't stress. So for our French knots, we're going to wrap 3 strands around our needle. So I'm going to do 2 wraps, 1, 2. And then I'm going to stick my needle back down through my fabric. And then this hand right here, where I have my, what I call the working thread, I'm going to slide my knot down to the surface of my fabric. Then I'm going to push my needle down and pull it through. So you want to make sure that that knot is at the surface of the fabric before you start pulling the thread through. That's probably the main key here. So you're going to wrap 2 times and then push the needle in, but don't actually pull it through the fabric yet. Make sure you've pulled the knot down, then push the needle through. That's kind of the key that I think people mostly miss. They're trying to pull the thread through the fabric once they've put the needle into the, like they would just start pulling now. Well, if your knot isn't at the surface of your fabric, it won't make its way there on its own, and you'll end up with a knot that's kind of floppy and not tight to your fabric. So that is the second step. It's not just wrap and pull. So it's wrap. Well, it is kind of wrap and pull. Wrap, pull your knot down, pull your thread through. It's kind of 3 steps. And there isn't really a method to where you're putting these French knots. You're just filling in the space. So you can start maybe by lining that upper outside. And then I go down through the sides, around the edges, and then I'll fill in whatever gap is left in the center of white fabric. Like, right, I want to get the edges first. 1, 2, needle, pull down. And if it's already, so see that one around the edge kind of filled in. I have a little spot right here, which I don't think is quite full enough. 1, 2, push my needle down, pull my knot down, pull my thread through. Okay, so I've filled in my knots, got them all in there, and then I'm actually gonna put one more kind of right here. It looks a little choppy, and I want to add one more. It's okay to improvise a little bit if you think something will look a little better and overlap some of these. Oops, sorry. Overlap some of the yellow. Okay, so we've got our French knots, and then now it's just our accent stitches. So they are drawn on your pattern, but you've obviously covered anything drawn on your pattern. So we're just gonna throw in these straight strands into the back of our petal. And how you do this is it doesn't matter where you put them, but just follow the same angle of the strands in front. Like these yellow strands, just follow the exact same angle and they'll blend in nicely. Oops, it's not a huge color contrast. It's just to give you like a little dimension, blend the colors a little bit. The darker yellow and this greenish yellow are quite similar in tone, so you don't see it as much as when we're doing it on the lighter yellow on the bottom half. On this petal, we do it at the back. You could even throw in a few here if you wanted to add that, if you like that better. On like this one and this one, we do the 832 on the back section. On this one, this big guy over here, this guy over here, you're gonna do the darker straight stitches through here. Yeah, and this one specifically, you're gonna go quite far up because you really wanna break up this big lower petal. Okay, so you've seen how these are kind of done, and you're just gonna apply that same logic to all of your poppies, and then we're gonna move on to our pretty pink peonies down here. And I will meet you back in a second to get started on that one. Okay, so we're ready to move on to our pink flower, and you're gonna follow this with a satin stitch as well. So I started with the inside pink, moving my way outwards. Again, you could really start on the outside and move your way in, but for this tutorial, I'm gonna be showing inside out. So it is a satin stitch, similar to what we did with our yellow poppies. We're starting with the DMC 3354, and we're going to do that in 3 strands again. So this whole flower is 3 strands. And yeah, we're going to stitch right through the center, and I'm going to do the exact same thing I did with the top part of the poppies where I split it into sections for my straight stitch. So you do have a bit more space that you need to fill on the outer petals than you do on the inner. So we'll start with one little section. I'll show you the example. You can apply this to the entire, to each one of these little edges. Same method for all of them. So splitting it in half again, and doing the exact same thing we did with our poppy. So just splitting each section in half over and over again until it's filled. And this is the same thing that when we come to a spot where, you know, I've done 4 stitches and I'm kind of full at the bottom there, I can start doing some of my stitches a little short of the others, which is a pretty common like satin stitch technique if you're using a asymmetrical shape. So if you're using a rectangle, if you're filling in a rectangle where it's identical on one side as it is on the other, it's not maybe necessary to do that. Sorry, I kind of reverted back to my not splitting it and just doing it. But we're going to go back and we're going to split that. I did a matching short stitch on the other side. But once you've split it in half, you're just filling in the last sort of option. And then really only had to put probably like one on each side of your little section, one shorter stitch. You might have to do more in certain spots. Like for this one, it's a little narrower. This one will be a little narrower at the base than the last one was. So one on each side to define kind of your borders. And then as you can see, I kind of already have not a ton of space at the bottom. So I'm going to do, I am going to split it one more time. Coming down, oops. And don't worry if like you go over, you know, if you put, like this technically says it's like a fuller area, you know, there's not space left for a stitch, but that doesn't mean that you can't still put one there. It's just sort of, you want to start limiting how much you're putting there. So now the rest of these I am going to do as short ones. Because like I said, I'm limiting how much and it doesn't have to be super short. Like this one's still almost down to the bottom. It's just sort of where I'm going to pretty much exactly the spot where where the 2 stitches meet and I run out of space. So following that until I can see that, hey, if I put this stitch down here, I'll cover the open space. And then following the same pattern around, I'm gonna do my little from the bottom of the bump part into here. And then splitting it from the center. And like I said earlier, you are covering what's going to happen with the French knots and the straight stitches, but it's not possible to do those first. So we can draw them on. We don't have to draw them on. I typically do just so that I don't forget that they're there. And then we just reference back to our pattern. So after I finish this one, I'll let you guys finish, and I'll finish off camera. And then we'll come back with our next shade, which is going to be DMC 3865, the white. We got the same thing. We just got 3 strands, and we're going to do the same little satin stitch. This one's actually probably more of a traditional satin stitch because they're wider areas and they're more even on how many stitches you'll need on each side, evenly matched. All right, so a little short stitch there since I have a lot of room left. Maybe throw one more right in there. And then I'm gonna finish off camera and I will meet you back for step 2 of our pink flower. Okay, so for our next bit, we're gonna be working on the little white parts, which are just these little sections here. So it's exactly the same concept. We're working with 3 strands and we're just filling it in. You can go in whatever way you feel most comfortable with a small section like this. I am not going to split it because I think it's small enough that I should be able to keep. I've got another knot in my thread. Good. I should be able to keep my strands pretty perpendicular, is that the right word? Parallel to each other without losing the angle that I'm looking for. And I'm just gonna stitch right into where I meet up with the pink section. I missed a stitch actually right there, so I'm gonna go back in. Like I said, you can just pop another one in if you look and say, oh, I left too large of a gap. You can just pop one in. Sometimes it'll even end up being like a little bit over top of the other one. Right here, it's just the tiniest of stitches to finish out the corner. And sometimes I put my needle underneath to try to give it, like, smooth out my stitches. Just following a satin stitch pattern to fill this space. If you get to the edge of these and you want, sorry, my thread's coming from the back. It's getting caught. I just pull it with my fingers down, like my end of my pinks. You can do a little bit of an angle to tuck it in, the same way that we did on like the corners and the curves of the other ones. It just maybe will help define the shape a little bit better. So you can start kind of, you can either do it perfectly straight like a satin stitch, or you can kind of do what we did before where we, like, instead of trying to do the tiniest little stitch, we can go in a little bit on the corner like that and sort of split it on a bit of an angle. They are such small stitches that whichever like way direction you want to do it, you're not going to see that much of it. So it's not going to make a huge defining difference in how you stitch it. Do a little bit more over here. So like you could split them a bit more and All right, so I think I need maybe one more stitch in there. My needle just came off of my thread. So you're just kind of going around doing these tiny little straight stitches that you kind of just have to follow the angle and the instinct of like your stitching style, which for beginners may seem like a crazy idea, but everybody stitches a little bit differently. Just like if you're a right-handed person or a left-handed person, you might like lean a certain way. I can't give you the exact, but I would, the more you fill them on the same angle. So if you're following a specific angle, keep following that angle. Don't try to change it just because you see maybe the way mine looks, or keeping them all like uniform is going to look a lot better than trying to adjust or compensate for what maybe you see mine doing. But the edge corner parts are going to be the part that I struggle with the most, of what angle to maybe put those on and how to keep them. I sometimes, just because if you're trying to do like your satin stitch perfectly perpendicular, I think perpendicular is the right word, it'll be difficult because it's such a tiny, tiny stitch that I angle it in sometimes just to give myself a chance to make it a little longer. Make sure I'm filling in the space. With like a nice sharp corner. Oops. The same principle applies that I mentioned earlier, sometimes that like less is sometimes more. I could have maybe put an extra stitch on the end there, but sometimes that overcrowded area, like if you overcrowd it by trying to put too many stitches, you just make it more, like it doesn't look as nice. You see that it's overcrowded. All right, and so you're just gonna keep filling in these little white spaces until you're all done, and then I will meet you back to do the outer area. Or if you feel like you kind of got the hang of it, you can skip through that. We're just going to be doing the exact same satin stitch. There isn't really anything new for the next color. We're just following the same idea of a satin stitch. So you can go ahead and finish all of your white, and I'll meet you back for our light pink. So for our outer petal of our pink poppy, we are just following the exact same method of splitting kind of our outer petals and going on a straight stitch. So I'm just going to section it off, I think, just to make it, the sections a little smaller. They are pretty big. And I'm just kind of following what I think would be like the angle to the center. That is sort of my trajectory. All the petals would sort of lead into the center, so and then once I've broken it into smaller, I'm gonna just keep breaking it into smaller until I'm all done. So, another knot. So if you're getting a lot of knots like I am, one of the key tricks, and this one's like a big one, holy moly. One of the keys to getting less knots is not pulling so fast. I'm pulling so fast that it's twisting and it doesn't have a chance to like untwist before it's into a knot. Not sure I can fix this one. It's a good one. So if you can see that, it's a big monster of a knot. All twisted up. I don't think I can get it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut my thread on one side of the knot, tie a knot in the end, secure it, and then honestly restart. So I will be back when I fix that. Okay, so I am ready to go. I clipped it at the knot. I tied a new end in my thread. I secured the end of the other end of the knot and had to restart. And that's like a pretty normal thing. So don't, if that keeps happening to you, yes, it's frustrating. Sometimes I've looked at the back of my pattern and I didn't notice that there was a knot and there's just a big old mess at the back. Honestly, that's fine too. It happens. My first project, there was so many knots at the back. Nobody sees the back. If it's something that bothers you, sure, yeah, of course, like go ahead and fix it. But if it's also something that makes you crazy and you're like, I don't want to keep going if I have to keep stopping and fixing these knots, and you're okay with it, just leave the knots. You're going to cover it. No one's going to see it. It's going to be the back. All right, so we're just splitting until it's full. So I'm going to finish this one petal. We've done quite a few of these now, so I think you guys are probably well equipped with what you need to know. And then I'm going to move on into the center and leave this to come back to. After you guys can finish all of yours and then come back and meet me to finish the satin stitch in the center, our straight stitches, and our little French knot ends. So this is probably the most tedious part of your pattern, or these flowers. This is why this pattern is a beginner, because it's not hard, it's just time consuming. And after you finish this pattern, you're going to feel like a pro if you're not already, if you're a new stitcher. I'm actually just following the knot split, another knot, stitching too fast. So I'm gonna put my needle through the knot for a sec. There we go. Oh boy, so many knots. Okay, now I'll split it because I didn't do that before. I was kind of just doing my straight satin stitch side by sides. And if you're comfortable that way, like you don't have to split this into sections. If you get going and you're like, oh no, I'm just doing it one stitch after the other and it's working for you, don't think you need to change your technique because I'm doing it one way, or that is the one thing that I'll say is about embroidery, is that there is no right or wrong method. There is literally just the method that works for you. I think sometimes people get so hung up on doing it exactly the same as they saw in a tutorial here, or they feel like, oh no, I saw something then said I was doing it wrong. And I was like, well, is it working for you? Does it look the way you want it to? Those are the two questions you got to ask yourself when you say I'm doing it wrong, or does it look the way you want it to? And is it working for you? Sometimes we learn new things. I still sometimes learn new things and I'm like, oh, that actually works better than the way I've been doing it for 5 years. If it works better and you like it better, great. If it works better and you don't like it better and you don't want to do it that way, that's fine too. If the end result is what you want, it doesn't matter how you got to the end result. I think that's what sometimes people forget. I guess unless you're entering it in some kind of contest. Okay, we're almost to the end of this one. Let's do this last little section. And you're just meeting up with where the other part finished. Like, I'm not necessarily stitching. I'm stitching right beside the hole that the white came up at. It's not the same hole, right beside. These little tiny ones on the edge are a little harder, but we're gonna make it work. It's harder for me to stitch. When you're doing these little tiny detailed ones, I normally get my face very, very, very close to my hoop. When I'm stitching, I can't put my face very close to the hoop, so it's sort of hard to see exactly where I want to go. But it might be a little messier than I would have hoped. All right, I'm gonna leave it because it's not, the more I do, less is more. Okay, so we are done that one. And then the next thing up is the center of this flower. And I'm gonna grab my, actually, first I'm gonna grab DMC 832. That is your satin stitch in the center. I'm gonna grab that in 3 strands. Okay, so for our center of this flower, this is just a straight satin stitch. So the same concept we've been using. Oh, I went right through. My knot did not hold. So the exact same concept we've been using the entire time. I'm going to do the same thing I've been doing the whole rest of the pattern, and I'm going to split it into sections. So I'm going to do my first one, and I'm going to kind of do my outside ones close to the edge on both sides. And then I'm going to come down, do a tiny little one on the outside of that one to try to fill in, kind of round out the ends. This is a really good example of less is more. If you try to put too many stitches, you're going to end up looking like you've made a square. I've done it so many times. I tried to just put so many stitches to make it look very rounded at the edges, and it just ended up looking like a square. All right. Nice and filled in. It doesn't have to be perfect. These flowers do not have a perfect center. They are not a nice, perfectly round middle. Oh, my needle's coming through instead of. All right, so I'm gonna tie off the back, and I'm gonna get DMC 3821 on my needle to do my straight stitches and French knots. Okay, so hopefully you've gotten some practice in from your French knots for your their poppies, because these are going to be some cute little French knots, and they're going to be just a 1 wrap French knot. So I'm going to go up into each kind of petal of this. So I'm kind of doing each one of these sections that has its own little bump. I'm going to go into each one. And do a little line through it. And since we can't see them from our pattern, you can kind of look, but a good guide would probably be pretty much almost every bump. You're kind of just evenly spacing them. Don't get too hung up on it. You'll oh, excuse me. Hopefully I remember to edit that out. If you saw that, I didn't. Okay, so before I get too far, I'm gonna make sure that I'm getting them evenly spaced, kind of following my pattern guide. Some of the bumps are really, this was one and this one's one, so I'm not gonna do both of those. I'm just gonna, but I am kind of going down the center of these. next. Do I want one more in there? Yeah, I do. Okay. So we've created these little lines, and then we can put a little French knot on the end. Granted, this is maybe a little bit more of a, like they're so tiny that it might feel a little bit hard if you're not super comfortable with it. Don't worry about it. So what I did here to make sure that my knot doesn't get lost in my satin stitch is I came up on one side of the straight stitch, and then I'm going to go down on the other side of the straight stitch, which will hopefully hold my knot from ending up through. So I just wrapped one time, came up, and then there we are. So same thing on the next one. I'm going to come up just like below where that I'm just going to come up just below where that yellow line ends, do one wrap, and then I'm going to come up on the opposite side of it so it'll hold my knot from going through, because sometimes what will happen when you're doing French knots on top of an area is they'll actually end up going through and between your stitches. So they'll end up at the base of the fabric, but because you didn't have anything stopping them, they'll go right through and they'll end up on the surface of the fabric, which depending on what, like the size of the stitch, this one, I'm not sure if it would actually get lost, but they can end up getting a little lost. So that stitch can stop them from doing that. If you stitch, just keeps it from staying. It keeps it staying on the surface. But we follow the same principle that we learned in the other French knots. One wrap in this case, because we don't want a small little knot, and then pushing it down, pulling our knot to the surface before pulling, oh no, our thread through. Where is it? There we go. One over. And okay, so I'm gonna finish these up off camera. You guys can do the same, and we will meet back in a minute to start on our stems. All right. Okay, so for the next section of our pattern, we're going to be doing a split stitch for all of our stems, and almost all of them except for we have one blue one over here and the light blue are going to be done in DMC 3814. This one will be 3817, but every other one will be 3814. So a split stitch in 3 strands. So how you're going to do a split stitch is you're going to start with just one basic forward stitch. And then you have 2 options. You can come up forward from your split stitch and then stitch back and split your stitches. Or you can come up from behind and come through. Both work. Both are splitting your stitches. There isn't, one of them takes more thread. So if you're going to go forward and then come backwards. So in this case, I'm going to show you really quickly. So if you're going to come forward and then stitch back and split your strands, you're using more thread. Whereas if you're coming backwards and splitting them, you're using less. I stagger between which one I use. I find stitching back, like I just did there, can be a little bit more difficult in finding your right spot. So I'll do this strand in splitting back. So we're stitching a stitch forward and then we're pulling our needle back up through the stitch, splitting it. And you have to find the spot you want to come up while your needle is at the back of the fabric, which is just like a eyeballing it, sort of hand-eye coordination. And like sometimes you just come up right in the right spot. Sometimes it takes me forever to find it. So as a beginner, I would say the stitch back and down method is a little bit easier, which I'll do a full demonstration. So this is the stitching back and up through method. And then on the next stem, which I'll do right after this, I'll show you I'll do the whole thing in the stitch back and down method. So with 3 strands, you're not splitting it evenly. You're gonna have like one strand on one side and another strand on the other side. I just kind of try to come up between them in the way that looks the most even. Most of the time I can't tell if I've got 2 on one side or 1 on the other side. So, okay, so let's do this whole portion of the stem in the stitch back and down method. So straight stitch forward, that one's kind of twisted, so I'm just gonna untwist it. So straight stitch forward, coming up from this fabric, a stitch length forward, and then coming back through. So kind of like an overlapping back stitch. And then the same thing, forward a full stitch, back down. And as you can see, yeah, I would take more thread because I'm going forward at the back all this way and then coming back instead of just coming up a little bit backwards. But it's easier to be a little bit more precise with where you want your stitches when you're able to see where to put the needle down. So whichever you prefer and feel more comfortable, I suggest trying them both, giving it a go and seeing what you like better. I find I don't have sometimes the greatest hand-eye coordination, so coming up through can be coming through from the back instead of down through from the front to split my stitch is difficult. So I just find this simpler and I don't have to think as much about it. So we got one last stem on this one. And for this part, for these larger leaves, you are coming a little bit into your leaf. And then when we do the leaf stitch, I'll show you how you're gonna, and you will apply this split stitch to all of your all of your stems. All right, so you can go around and you can, using the 3814, do all of your stem stitches, or split stitches, sorry, all of your stems, except for obviously this one. And then I'll meet you back when you're finished that, and we will work on we'll do the leaf on this stem here for our demo, and then we'll also do one of the leaves over here, just a knot without the stem through the center. So I will see you back in just a second. Okay, so we just finished out our stems, or you would have just finished them out. I'm gonna go on to our next step. And you would probably, or could still have 3814 on your needle. So I'm going to show you these ones first, and then we can hop over to those ones after. So we've got a line down the center of our leaf, and we're going to use that as our guideline. So we're going to I like to go to about the widest part of my leaf, and that's where I start my first center stitch. And then for my second stitch, I'm coming up on either side of the center stitch, and I'm going to just go just below, but a little bit tucked almost behind to create like a nice sharp point. So, and then I'm going 1 needle's width apart from my last stitch. So essentially that's meant to mean that I could fit 1 needle in between there. And up at the top, I'm doing the same thing. I'm kind of making sure that I'm coming up below and then meeting up. So this is the leaf stitch. The fishbone leaf stitch is similar, and some people call this a fishbone, but a fishbone kind of crosses over a bit more. So you wouldn't meet at that center line, you would cross over that center line. So I call this just the leaf stitch. You're creating kind of like the spine of the leaf by following down the middle. And I'm just meeting up. each stitch will meet up at that center line until you reach that center line, and then it almost turns into a bit of a satin stitch. Whereas a fishbone, you cross over. My knot is, the threads from my knot is pulling through. Just gotta use your fingers to kind of pull that back. If you can use your needle too if you need. So I often do like one side, then do the other side and meet up. Until my pattern becomes, I've made a mistake. I've left too big of a gap right there. So I'm actually going to stitch back, and I'm going to throw one stitch just right in there. I'm not going to worry about it having a match because it doesn't matter. You can't see it. The goal is more the angle. That's why I do a match, because then the angle is right. But once it becomes not symmetrical on each side, so for example, once I get to where I'm going to be meeting up with my flower, I'm not going to have the stitches meeting anymore. Or if for example, this leaf was a completely different shape on one side and you weren't really able to match them up because you needed more stitches on one side than on the other, I wouldn't worry about going back and forth. I would just stitch one side, stitch the other side, and have the stitches obviously still meeting up, but they don't need to meet up with like a partner, if that makes sense. So now that I'm at the center, I am going to work on just one side. And for this one, my goal here is to keep my leaf stitches on this, my angled stitches on the same angle, or at least as close to the same angle as possible as I go around. Now your pink petal is going to be finished. I obviously have just been doing the tutorials for this, so I never kept going. So you're just going to be meeting up with where those stitches are. Like we did inside of here, you're just putting them in basically a hole next to where the hole you went down for the pink. And I'm trying to keep the same nice angle to create some unity. I missed a stitch again. It's going back in. Yeah, I just want to keep it like with that same angle, so it still looks like these stitches would be continuing down if they were like in behind, right? Like it's layered over top, so it's behind this flower, and we're just following that same pattern. And as we get to the edge where I'm trying to round out my leaf, I tend to do what I did on the other one, whereas I just stitch inward a little bit more to create the curve. So right now I'm going to kind of tuck that in behind just a little bit. And then the next one, do the same, or meeting up with the bottom there. My thread twisted a little bit though, so I'm going to actually pull. I don't want a twisted thread, so I'm going to pull it out a little bit and let it go down a little flatter. And the same thing, I'm trying to keep the angle where it's pointing inward, right? Okay, and then jumping over and finishing out the same side, the other side. I'm going to need to grab some more thread, so I'll meet you back here once I've done that to restart. All right, and then just picking up where I left off. Again, following that same angle. And this side, you know, the angle might be a little bit different than the other side, but you want to keep as much like unity as possible. And the one thing you should see is as we start to get to like the edge, I'm coming out to have almost like a bit of that straighter side, so we can, I'm sorry, the fibers from the back are pulling to the front, which is just where I need to trim my ends better. So again, just following that same angle till we're at the very bottom. Okay. There we go. So that is your leaf stitch for like the standalone leaves. And then I'm going to grab my 832 in 3 strands, and I'll show you one of these ones where we're doing the exact same thing, but you're just meeting on the outside of that straight split stitch so that you're not stitching through it, but I'll do a little demo of that one. All right, so coming up from the top the same way we did with our regular leaf stitch. And then for this one, I'm actually just going to meet right at the top of that line. And then you can just work on one side at a time because you aren't actually meeting up, but I'm going to drop down just a little bit below it and throw my stitches in beside it. And depending on the angle of the stem in the center, you don't want to cross over that stem. You don't want to cover it. So you're kind of like going beside it, and I'm making some of the stitches maybe a little bit longer to try to keep the angle that isn't like covering it. There we go. So then see how I'm now at the bottom? I'm going to continue to tuck them in, my stitches in underneath. I'm going to do a shorter one too, just so that I'm not coming, like I don't want the end of them to come up on the side here. So we'll do a short one and another long one, which it'll come up a little bit up the side, but I want it to still like round out. And then for my last one, to create that little curve, just doing a short one, and I'm tucking it in behind, which does create a nice curve to create a rounded side. And then we'll jump over and we'll do the exact same thing on the other side. It's not Okay, for these little buds, you're going to be doing a 3-strand satin stitch. So similar to what we've already done, using a satin stitch, but just on a little bit of like an oval shape. So I'm not really splitting them into sections because it's small enough that I don't have to, but I am following the line on each side, just because it's got a bit of an angle at the bottom, and then trying to stay kind of very close to the stitch beside it. Don't want to, and especially at the base here where I'm coming up, I'm almost coming up behind the last stitch to help create that sort of curved shape, and rounding out my little buds. And then just, yeah, like almost tucking it in behind a little bit just helps create that rounded shape. So down the one side, then coming up. Yeah, very close to the stitch beside it, just because we want that like more seamless kind of look, so that it looks like you don't know which stitch starts where, to create a really nice round filled in space. And I like to kind of put my needle underneath and give it a little fluff up. It just gives a little bit of dimension to the satin stitch, which I like. The more texture sometimes it has, the more, just gives it a little bit of intrigue. That's like a personal preference though, so if you don't like that, that's an optional choice. Okay, so the same thing on all of them. You're just kind of filling it in with a little satin stitch, and it's 3 strands of the DMC 225. And yeah, trying to really get in kind of behind so that doesn't, so that you can't really tell where one stitch starts, the other one ends. And then next up, we're gonna do some more French knots. These ones, next set, we've done a couple examples of the French knots. I'm not gonna do too much. By now you should have a good idea of how to do them. Okay, so our next step, you're gonna be working on French knots. So I'm gonna demo them on this woven wheel because we're gonna be doing this one anyways for our demonstrations, but you will be applying the same principles to all of your clusters of French knots. So I'll give you some tips on all of that. This is the same as any other French knot we've done. We're just using 6 strands, so it's definitely a thicker one. And for the middle here, we're just gonna do 1 wrap. So they're large. This would also be like the equivalent size to using 3 strands and 2 wraps. So if you feel like we start doing them and you're like, you know what, I really don't love doing French knots with 6 strands. I find it kind of more difficult than when I did it with 3 strands. You can switch back to 3 strands and just wrap your needle more times. It's just the different effect. Sorry, that's just got another strand stuck in there. Okay. So for our French knots, we are holding our needle in like a T shape between our thread, wrapping that thread run time, pushing our needle into the fabric, then sliding our knot down, and then pulling our needle through the fabric. And when you're filling in any space, I like to outline it a little bit. So for this case, I'm just doing, well, a very rough draft since I'm not doing a full outline, but I don't like to make them like too uniformed in the sense of like, I don't want to do 1 row, then 1 row, and then 1 row. So I kind of just fill them in a little messy, but I start with the outside layer and then make my way to the inside. So wrapping it 1 time, coming down, pulling it through, and it does become one fluid motion as you do it a little bit more. If you're finding like you can do it all and pull and push your needle into the fabric and then pull it through, that does become like you don't separate those motions every single time. So for me, it's like I pull my needle up, I wrap it. As I'm putting my needle in, I pull my knot down pretty much at the same time, push my needle through and pull. So that's just a very slowed down version. As you get more comfortable, you will probably start to do them in, there are just threads everywhere. It's all stuck on my desk. This one's like wrapped around everywhere. I gotta snip that. It's just a thread from my desk. Okay, so wrapped around into the fabric, pulled down, and pulled through. Oh no. So my knot came undone because I looked at the back of my fabric and I actually hadn't pulled this thread all the way through, which created a little, like a slack in the tension. So, okay, so start that over. Wrap, push my needle down, pull my knot down through the fabric. All right. And same, if we wanted to do bigger knots, we could do 2 wraps. Might actually do some of my middle ones with 2 wraps. Sometimes, and so one of the, this is because this is one of the examples I'm going to use for how you're going to fill in these clusters here. You can vary between 1 and 3 wraps for these clusters. So there isn't a set number of wraps you're going to use. You will use 6 strands, but the different wraps make a different texture and a different depth of your knots. And for some of the inner wraps, the same way I'm doing the inner wraps on these knots, the inner ones of the cluster, I used more wraps. And then the ones that were kind of meant to taper off and round out the sides, and taper off the sides, those ones I did 1 wrap. So that's sort of how I created a bit more dimension to it. And I'll just give you, show you that on here really quickly. So you can see that some of them are smaller and some of them are bigger, and I actually layered them on top of each other. So some of them I did quite a few wraps. I maybe even did a few more just to make them really chunky and big, and then I layered them on top of each other. So you can see like ones in here, might have even been 4 wraps. I'm just making these big balls. 3 wraps is probably a good comfort zone to be at. As a beginner, doing 4 or 5 wraps to make them extra chunky can sometimes get a little bit more difficult. So 1 wrap along your outer knots, and then 2 wraps as you go in, and then some of those really big ones you're wrapping 3 times. And just be careful not to pull your tension too tight around your wraps, because that's where it's going to make it difficult to pull your needle through. Okay, so you can continue on with the French knots for all of these in the appropriate colors, or you can work on the woven wheel with me, and then we'll go back to the French knots last. But I do often recommend doing your woven wheels last, just because as you're doing all of these French knots here, you probably want to finish these first, just because the woven wheel can be kind of delicate, and if you snag it attempting to do a French knot, you're gonna really regret that. So if I can make a recommendation, pop back and finish your French knots at the very end, and we'll continue on, or sorry, pop over and finish your French knots right now, and then you can come back to me and finish this woven wheel after you've finished your French knots around, if you haven't already done them. Okay, woven wheels are probably my favorite stitch. I just love the way they look. So there's 2 different kinds of woven wheels. There's open woven wheels, which is the one where we have our French knots, and then there's closed woven wheels. I am going to show you both. But the thing that you need to see right now is how we're going to make 12 strands. So you just take your 6 strands, and we're going to thread our needle just like we normally would through our 6 strands. But instead of coming and having like our tail hang down, we're going to pull that needle until it's at the center. And then we're going to take the 2 ends of our thread, I'm going to take the ends of our thread and I'm going to actually knot them together like this, creating a nice big knot at the end, and then pulling my needle to the halfway point. So now my needle has 12 strands. So now we are stitching with 12 strands. It's called folded over or doubled up. So the first part we're going to do is our spokes. You can do these in 6 strands if you wanted to, but for ease of having to not change what's on my needle, just gonna do 12, and you can too. So we're creating spokes by just stitching a straight stitch on these lines here. Okay, so after we finished our spokes, you are just going to come up between 2 spokes as close as you can to the center space. So right there, just in between the 2. And this is where we start our over-under pattern. So we're gonna come up underneath, through between those 2, and then you're just gonna start going over and under. So I typically start with, I'm just gonna untwist this a little bit. My strands are kind of twisty. So I'm going to start by going over that first one and then under. And for this first row, I'm really tucking it in beside my French knots. I want it to lay as tight to that as possible because I don't want you to be able to see the fabric underneath. I want to kind of create a nice tight weave. And it really is kind of like a weave. So on my next row, I can I don't have to worry about pulling my tension quite so much, but I just want to lay it up against my next row. And you're pulling as like gently and consistently with your tension as possible. Some of the things that get in the way the most that you have to be cautious of are getting caught on things like the top of your hoop. If it gets caught on there and you kind of all of a sudden feel this jerk, because it gets stuck and you don't know it's coming and you're pulling and then it goes poof, you will kind of screw up the tension of your whole French knot. So sometimes mine even gets caught on like the extra fabric around the corners or even on the hoop itself, because you've got all this hanging loop, or like the top of my hoop stand, it'll get stuck on and I'm pulling thinking nothing of it, and it hits like you hit a wall. Like right now, I'm kind of wrapped around my hoop stand. Those are all the things that will inevitably screw up the tension of your woven wheel. And because you're not stitching down and securing each stitch, you really can throw off the way that wheel looks. And I'll kind of give you an example of what happened. So like, see right here, something got snagged and then it kind of messed up my whole wheel. So now to try to fix that, I have to pull on all the spots, and it really is hard to fix. Like, I'm not sure if I'll be able to get this to go back into the way it was, and it's just because something grabbed this and it pulled it, and then now it's, so I can kind of try to tuck it in, but it's pretty hard to fix it. You can make it extra messy if you want to, but, oopsie, and then I'm trying to fix it, you can make it worse. So one of the only ways I find is just pulling on these to fix it. And sometimes you just end up with a more messy look, which isn't always the look you want. It's a pretty look and I like it, but it isn't always exactly what we're looking for. And that's personal preference too. So as an example, I got stuck on my fabric over here. But because I'm going nice and slow, I saw it coming and I adjusted and I didn't let it totally mess me up. But yeah, we're just going over and under until we filled and covered all of the spokes. So my rule of thumb is once your spokes are no longer visible, I go around 1 or 2 more times to give it some extra oomph, because once you've covered the spokes, your wheel, instead of being able to go out, like moving outwards, it'll start to go up and it gives it more poof. So if you're trying to get extra height to your woven wheel, just keep going after your spokes are covered and the wheel has no other place than up to go. And I even do it sometimes like as I'm going, I'll like go like this and I'll pull a little tighter on one row and it gets underneath the row in front of it and it creates some extra dimension. So a lot of the time with our woven wheels, we'll have to stop and get more thread. They do take quite a bit of thread. So what we'll do to get that, I'm almost done. I could probably stop without getting more thread. Maybe, I don't know actually, probably not. But what you want to do is I typically make it, I go to like this. Okay, if I'm going around my wheel, my next spot is to go under this spoke right here. So instead of going under, I'm just going to stitch right down. I normally pick a spot at a spoke just so it gives a more natural look. And then I'm going to do the same thing I always do and tie off at the back, but I'm going to be extra careful because if I pull that tension the wrong way, I'm going to screw up my wheel at the front. And after I've secured it, just going to get a new thread and I'll come back and show you guys how I come up. Okay, and then for coming up, I do the exact same thing in reverse. I come up on the other side of the spoke that I went down under so that it almost like looks like I just went under it. And then I keep going on my pattern. So you can't really tell I went down. You can't see, it just looks like I went under that spoke. And then it doesn't disrupt the pattern. And yeah, that's kind of a seamless transition. And we're getting close to that spot where I've covered the spokes for the most part. And I'm just keeping going around a little bit more. Almost covered most of them. I think I've got a little bit on one, but for the most part you can see that now my woven wheel is just pretty much starting to go upwards instead of down, or sorry, out. It's just headed in the upward direction. It's just adding more oomph to it. Okay, and then just have this one little one right here, which hasn't quite been covered, but what I'm gonna do, if you have one spoke that's just, hey, she doesn't wanna get covered and she's kind of sticking out a little bit, but you've been going around and all the other ones are nicely covered, this is where that's where I make my final stitch and I come down right over top of it and I just cover it up. Give it the little cover and then I am done. So that one is all finished and we're gonna move on to the closed woven wheel and I'll meet you guys when you're done your spokes because we already know how to do that. Okay, so you probably by this point are going to be able to do this without much instruction, but it is exactly the same as your closed woven wheel or your open woven wheel. You just start a little closer to the center. So we're going to come up between two spokes and I'm going to go over the first one. It doesn't matter if you go over or under the first one, but we're going to start with over, under the next, over and then under, over and then under. And you'll see that like if you don't have an odd number of spokes, you won't be able to do the over under pattern. So because it's an odd number, every time you go around the wheel, it changes. So if you had an even number, you would just end up going over the same ones and under the same ones each way around the circle. And we're just gonna follow the same thing, following the same advice from before, watching your tension, moving slowly, trying not to get stuck on things. Yeah, And then if you need more thread, the same thing. And we finish the same way. So I will finish out this woven wheel, and then yeah, we are coming close to the end. And I'm getting hooked on everything, so I'm not doing a very good example. So one other tip is that obviously you're going to have a lot going on in your pattern right now. So there's going to be other things in your way. Just being very cautious of what your needle is hitting. So as I'm coming up here, I might even use my finger at the back to push on the fabric, which then pushes my needle up a bit, which gives me a little bit of clearance to get past all of the other elements on the hoop. Because one of the things about doing the woven wheels last is that, yes, there's a lot of stuff in your way. But in a crowded pattern like this, it can be really frustrating to do your woven wheels first and then nick them as you're going with a French knot or just any of the things that you have going on. All right. All right, and we are pretty much done all the way around. I got covered all of my spokes, and I've got some nice fluffy rows. So I'm gonna just stitch down one longer stitch to create my last kind of petal. And then I like to give it a little fluff sometimes, especially if certain parts aren't even. I've got like quite a little loop at this side, and then just fluff up the outside so that they all kind of have a little bit of symmetry. But the reality is roses never have much symmetry. They always are a little wild, so it's okay if they're not a perfect symmetrical rose. So we have finished all of these. You're going to work on your you're going to have finished your French knots, which we've worked on multiple times. And then you're pretty much done all your stitching. So if you need to reference back to one of the stitches we did to finish a spot, you can go through the chapters, which is all in the description. You can click on the description of the chapter you need. So whether that be French knots or leaf stitch. And then the next step is going to be backing your hoop. So once you've finished all your stitching, you're going to come back and it'll be time to back our hoop. So I will see you in a second. So for this tutorial purpose, I'm going to use the one that I've already finished. And I did put a second piece of fabric back there. And if you have fabric laying around, that's a totally optional extra. I often don't put two pieces of fabric, but when I was working on this one, I did add that extra piece after I had finished, just because when I take photographs of it, it's nice to have a second piece. But most of the time when they're hanging on the wall, I wouldn't worry too much about it. But if you have extra fabric laying around, any fabric, doesn't have to be anything fancy, just like a plain fabric, that's a great addition. And we are going to trim around our edges. So we have about a 1/2 inch to at most an inch. So you should have kind of, just if you trim off the corners, about 1/2 inch of fabric, maybe a little more. I'm not doing the most beautiful job, but that is okay. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be trimmed so that when you're doing your next step, you can, sorry, my brain stopped there for a second, looking for my needle. So you're gonna have, so that you have an even amount around the outsides. And if you still had those corners, they kind of get folded in and make a mess. So you wanna make sure that it's nice and clean and trimmed for this next step. So basically what we want to do, if you are keeping it in your hoop for displaying, we're going to close the back. Now, if you have a different plan for this, if you're planning to put it in like a frame or something like that, you might want to keep it in the square. That's totally up to you. But if we're keeping it in the hoop to display it, the next thing you're going to want to do, if you have the heat erasable pen, you are going to take some sort of heat. So whether that's a blow dryer, an iron or something, and you're just going to go around and like iron your pattern gently, blow dry your pattern gently, and get rid of those heat erasable lines. You are going to want to go to the back and just make sure that you don't have any threads that are like hanging. I had to do a little oopsie that I forgot and fixed. So I trim all my edges just so that when things get sandwiched, like closed, you're not seeing lines and threads hanging around and some of that stuff. Once you've closed it and you hang it on the wall, you might be able to see it. So good suggestion is to make sure you don't have any dangling threads. And then after that, you're on to the closing part. So you've trimmed it up. And I always go with 6 strands of whatever shade of thread you have left. If you have lots of one color or you don't think you'll use another color again for something else, you can just grab whatever the shade that is, and you just want to make sure, I just kind of measure it out by going around the circle. So is it long enough to make it around this circle? And then you're doing a running stitch. I always start at the bottom. That's just a personal preference. And then I do about 1/4 of an inch spaced running stitch, which is just where you go in and out. So there'll be like a gap between each stitch because you're not going backwards like a back stitch, or you're not filling in the gap. So all the way around, 1/4 of an inch. Smaller your stitch is, the tighter your cinch will become, so the flatter it'll lay at the back. And around we go. Okay. So we are at the end, and I'm just going to make sure that the end of my needle comes up right next to where I went down. So kind of matching those up. And I like to pull on the short end, the end that was up against it. And I pull on both, making sure you're pulling both. And then it just cinches your fabric closed so that it pulls that in. And then I just give it a tie. It's nothing too complicated. You can make a few stitches into your thread or into your fabric to secure your thread if you'd like. I normally just do a double knot and it stays. I'm not putting that much strain on this, so I don't worry too much about it staying, but just giving it an extra tug. There we go. And then you have finished the back of your hoop. It is all done. If you put the extra fabric back here, you have like a nice clean finished. If you don't have the extra fabric, you will be able to see the back parts of your thread. Some of the deluxe kits are gonna come with a piece of felt. That is there so that you can trace out a little circle. So I just do like a rough circle, and I'll show you. That did not trace at all. Okay. So you're gonna trace out a circle. My pen did not do what it was supposed to do. There are different additional methods for backing to finish the back. I have recently come to change a little bit of the way that I back, only because I used to sometimes attach this felt to the outside of this, but a lot of people hang their hoops on the wall, and when you do that, you create an extra layer, making it so that the hoop doesn't lay as flat on the wall. So now, when we do have the extra felt, it's kind of meant to replace the fabric section, so you cut out a circle and you really just tuck it inside. So if you got a deluxe kit that did include things like your pen or add-ons like the felt, you just tuck this inside of here. And the point of that is just to create a nice covered, to cover the stitches at the back, to clean up your back. You can write like a little message, like when it was stitched or something like that. And then, and then it finishes the front, or finishes the back a little bit more clean. But on certain fabrics, like something really heavy like this one, we don't necessarily want a second piece of fabric on our pre-printed. And when we pull our pieces closed, it's just thick enough that you can just hang it on the wall and you're all done. So depending on the kit type you got, if you had the felt included, you can add it into the back like that. If not, you can just cinch it closed. If you do want to try a fancier method, there are tons of YouTube tutorials online that show different ways to back your hoops, and most of the supplies are found either on Amazon, but we like to just go with a nice simple finished back so that if you ever do need to access, like say a strand of thread that's kind of coming loose or that's, you know, showing from the front, you can get in there nice and easily and nothing's too permanent. I know there's some gluing options that become a little more permanent, and I like to keep things a little more accessible. So at this point you are done stitching and you have created a beautiful hoop. If you are interested in adding some text here, I have included in the pattern, I have included a little tutorial on adding some text, but really the most efficient way is to use a template and draw out what you want it to say here, whether it's a name or something like that, and then adding a split stitch is a really great text stitch, and you can just add that there. Sometimes people will use just a back stitch or a whipped back stitch. I have included a little page in your digital file about adding text, so you can add whatever you like, and then you're all finished and you've created this beautiful wreath hoop. So I can't wait to see what you created. If you do finish this hoop, I would love to see it on social media, so please tag me. And thank you so much for joining me on creating this embroidery hoop.